Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the War Report, and we have returning on the every, I suppose you'd say biannual schedule. Our good friend, right from the cold tundras, the desolate dark, which I imagine is this time of year, St. Petersburg, Russia. One vile Varangian. So welcome back. This is your third appearance on the show, and yeah, as you were saying, it seems like the news moves around us, the world revolves around us because just more news out of Russia, whether that be the Navalny thing, whether that be Nord Stream 2, just it just seems like really it doesn't stop, and you show up at just the perfect times. We definitely did not plan this ahead of time. I definitely didn't think, oh, hey, there's a lot happening in Russia. We should probably talk to the Russian guy. No, pure coincidence, but unironically, though, we said back in August, hey, see you in February. And lo and behold, February came a lot sooner than I thought it would be, so why don't you just give an introduction for yourself for any newcomers who have come along since and may not be familiar with you or your so-called work?
Yeah, all right. So, as you've just said, it seems like Putin is directly listening to me. Maybe I'm an advisor of the Kremlin or something like that, because he seems to create content for the war report every 6 months, always on schedule. But technically speaking, I used to be just a shit poster on Twitter. I think that's a fair summary of my so-called work. But a quite popular shit poster, to my defense. People still listen to me for some reason. And I've been off Twitter for quite a while now. It's like my 7th or 8th ban. I stopped counting. This time I think I was banned because we trolled the official account of the Ukraine. At Ukraine, basically, we organized a flash mob on the New Year where we all spammed them, like hundreds and hundreds of Russian accounts, spammed them with a picture of a kitten in a New Year's garment, and with a caption that said, like, for the New Year, I wish everyone happiness and health and the elimination of Ukrainian statehood. And
Yes, that was
obviously,
that was very fun.
Ominous.
yeah, obviously
Ominous.
they had to purge me for that again. Like, the Ukrainians are powerful on Twitter. Never attack the Ukrainian Zog if you want to stay on Twitter. That's just advice from me. But yeah, now what am I doing now? I technically still run a small Telegram account for my Russian audience, although I don't know whether we are going to make it a topic on the show, but I'm soon going to quit even posting on Telegram and just basically be a private person, which is not good for my podcasting credentials, I guess, but I'm just a little bit sick of politics. And not just sick, actually, this will be quite relevant for what we're going to talk about on the show. Like,
Oh, so you found a wife. Oh, congratulations.
I wish, but thank you. I mean, if any nice girls from St. Petersburg, Russia, not Florida, are listening, like, hey, hit me up. But there is a reason why I'm a bit tired or oversaturated from politics, which is basically that I have nothing to say anymore. Like, I feel like in Russia, at least, we have won recently with these Navalny protests. I think we are going to start from A and not from Z, but to give a very brief summary, I think the reaction from our state to these protests was the exactly right one. And the general trends in Russian politics since like December 2020 are pretty encouraging. And I basically feel like I don't need to say anything anymore because Putin just does what I want from him. So my role as kind of a political commentator becomes more and more redundant. Like, I don't want to just shitpost all day on Telegram about how great Putin is, like everyone knows already.
So you're being repurposed as a Western subversion agent. You'll be returning to Germany soon, as I understand.
Yeah, perhaps. Although, like, I came up with a funny new neologism to describe my new political worldview. I now call myself a Putinist plan truster.
Yeah, they laughed at me when I came out with that. So.
Oh, really? Now you want to claim the copyright for that? Okay, we can
No,
we can
nothing
fight
like
over
that.
that in court.
Listen here, we was Putinists.
All right, you was Putinist. But okay, yes. Where should we start? Are we starting with the Navalny stuff, or
I think Navalny's a proper starting point, and then we can get into Nord Stream 2 as follow the general timeline since the last time you've been on, which was like last August, sort of things. Put a bow on the Belarus topic because that seemed to have all but come to a close, and continue on from there. So. Yeah, as you all know, it looks like Lukashenko has yet again triumphed, for better or for worse, and he allegedly was supposed to step down in January of this year, but that didn't seem to happen. So I don't know. Maybe you can give us some more insight. We all know St. Petersburg right on the border of Belarus. Look, we're real geography experts here, but with that being said.
Yeah, I like Belarus. There's not so much to say about it anymore. Basically, you just summarized that Lukashenko won because, well, there is maybe one thing that is quite noteworthy, which is basically the proof that if a given elite is intent on staying in power and is not afraid of actually using force and using the police properly, then color revolutions become quite difficult or maybe near impossible. Like, I think the reason we saw the Maidan succeed in Ukraine is because their leader was Yanukovych, who himself was maybe slightly more pro-Russian or more closely tied to Russia via his business links, but it was not like a committed Russian ally or something like that. Actually, his political platform was Euro-integrationist. He himself wasn't too opposed to like the EU and the West. He was more or less just a corrupt oligarch who was, unlike Lukashenko, who is a strongman, a real strongman. So Yanukovych, for him, it wasn't very important to stay in power, actually. I think he just wanted to secure his safe retirement or something like that. And that's why he didn't allow police to use proper force when the Maidan was going on, which could have prevented it, I guess, because in Belarus we see that Alexander Lukashenko was not afraid to defend his power, to use the police properly, to disperse rioters, and all it took was just for him to wait until the protest kind of dissipated. I mean, he still remains, and Lukashenko is an objectively unpopular president, as we have discussed on previous shows. So actually, he manages to maintain power with mostly just police force, and like even he can stay in power because he has a will to. Yeah, that's about it for Belarus.
I would say that
it's amazing. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would say that pretty much sums it up pretty well, and there's not really much I can add to it. And as you were saying.
Oh, it's amazing that Yanukovych didn't play it the same way. I think part of the reason maybe is that he probably thought he could strike a deal in between.
Yes, exactly.
Both East. Yeah, and it cost him everything. He thought he could be reasonable with them, and.
I think maybe people like Lukashenko, I think they haven't learned too much from the Maidan, but they've learned at least something. Like if Lukashenko had done his homework, he would have prevented the anti-government sentiments as such. Like he would have introduced some reforms which are overdue, but at least he learned that like if you want to stay in power, you have to fight for it.
Right, and he speaking of introduction, he also introduced the American embassy since the inception of the country. That's going to be now a problem for quite some time, and it's just interesting. He kind of courted both sides, and basically, in the nick of time, kind of saved himself, although only temporarily. He didn't learn that much from Yanukovych. He's much luckier in many ways.
He's not very smart, unfortunately.
Yeah.
He's not very smart, but committed. And actually, like the situation in Belarus, I think now we can safely say that it played out more favorably for Russia than for the West.
Yeah.
Because since the revolution didn't succeed, and the attempt itself, basically, it is quite similar maybe to the failed coup in Turkey, where they tried to overthrow Erdogan, and since it failed, Erdogan went on a much more sovereignist geopolitical course, and with Lukashenko, he hasn't many options to go on a sovereignist course, but for him, Russia is now the only place where he can turn. So he cannot play this funny geopolitical game anymore, where he tries to sit between old chairs at the same time.
Yeah. It is as you make that point where the pivot between the great powers. Now, again, Turkey has much more much more room to move because of that, as opposed to Belarus. Not saying Belarus has nothing from that sort, but it looks like that did play out. But as I've been predicting with Turkey, and of course Belarus being a smaller example, much less leverage to throw around, it did eventually swing back into Russia, at least for now. We'll see how that plays out. But I did also want to get your take briefly on a conflict that was born, lived, and died in between the time you were on last time and now. Now, that, of course, is the conflict in the Caucasus between Armenia and Azerbaijan, with the way that played out and with Russia's role in it. And it seems like they also managed to, despite all odds, come out in a position of relative strength there. Even though I'm not going to lie, it looked pretty nasty even up until the last day of that, what was it, month and a half, 7-week war.
Yeah. Perhaps I actually don't have a strong opinion on that. I think the conflict is probably very interesting geopolitically, but I'm not too familiar with the region, unfortunately. Like maybe the pro-Russian cope take or something like that. Maybe it's not cope. I don't know. But I just don't know whether it was a victory for Russia or not. But the people who say that it was a victory for Russia point out that basically Russia, for the first time, managed to force Armenia and Azerbaijan into a position where Russian troops are actually allowed to be stationed in Nagorno-Karabakh, which apparently the Kremlin wanted to do for quite a long time, and now it achieved that. But there are some other objections, like I think, if I'm not mistaken, people can try to fact check me here, but if I'm not mistaken, now Azerbaijan has a land route to Turkey or something like that, which is probably not very good for Russia.
Yeah,
there is, and people are surmising that it might one day be used for this inevitable pipeline that's supposed to come from the Caspian. Honestly, the first time I heard about this pipeline was in the very late 90s and early 2000s. That might be the case. I don't want to undermine it, but I'm just saying it's been a very long time, and I still, I haven't seen any formal talks about introducing this yet. So, I don't know. But I see what you mean. It can become problematic because now Azerbaijan and Turkey can, effectively share a border, although it's monitored by the Russians, which
yes,
it's less than what I think the Turks had hoped for.
I mean, well, obviously, Turkey will have now much more influence in the Caucasus. But one thing that's certainly good for Russia is that Armenia's president, what was his name? His last name is Pashinyan. I forgot what his first name was, but anyway, Pashinyan. He came to power as a consequence of the Velvet Revolution, which was another color revolution in the post-Soviet space. And even though he didn't completely sever ties to Russia because Armenia is too strategically dependent on Russia, he did everything that he could as far as, cutting dependence on Russia goes, and led a pretty pro-European, Euro-integrationist politics and things like that. But now that they have lost the war and they've lost it to a significant degree because, for example, Pashinyan was removing very experienced generals just because they were trained in Russia, for example, and he didn't sign important arms deals for the supply of Russian arms and things like that. Anatoly Karlin has a interesting article on his blog about that. You can go and read it. I'm not too familiar with the situation there, but anyway, Pashinyan was basically not very good for Russia, and now he became very, very unpopular as a consequence of losing the war, because like the Armenian nationalists are pretty powerful now, who see him as a backstabber of the Artsakh Republic, because he also refused to properly support it with Armenian forces. Basically, the Artsakh Republic relied on its own self-defense forces and volunteers from Armenia, but didn't receive much in terms of support from the regular Armenian forces and things like that. So Pashinyan completely discredited himself politically, and even though he still holds on to power, I think things like the next Armenian elections or things like that could bring some interesting changes.
Yeah, I definitely see that, and as we discussed on the show, probably back in November when the peace treaty was first announced, I think that was like the second week in November, it seemed like what the goal was, at least from the outside perspective, beyond the two combatants on the ground and their individual immediate goals, was discredit Russia in their own backyard by using this puppet put in by a color revolution. This guy, quite literally backed by Soros money, where he doesn't sign defense deals with Russia. He doesn't integrate air defenses, for example, like in Syria. And one of the big things we saw there is a lot of the Turkish and Turkish-backed attacks we saw, particularly with the suicide drones, were a lot of them get shot down in Syria because of integration of air defense, whereas they were one of the deadliest aspects of this most recent war in the Caucasus, because Armenian air defenses simply could not handle the amount of these drones that, again, were pretty much strapped for one use, strapped with explosives or whatever, and flown into enemy positions. Their air defense couldn't handle those. They were overwhelmed by them, because their air defenses were, again, out of date. And you even had, like, Syrian S-200 shooting these sort of things down. So it goes back to, I would say, probably more the competence of the operators of the system rather than the actual system itself. Not that, again, not that an air defense system from, 1967, 1970 is really your first choice, but again, having somebody who is skilled with it and trained how to use it and knows how to use it properly is much better than just leaving it to some people who inherited it after the collapse of one of the world's largest empires, so to speak.
No, yes, indeed. Also, another thing that I found noteworthy about this Armenian and Azerbaijani conflict is, I don't have an explanation for it, but I think it's quite interesting that when that was going on, we didn't see neither Russian nor Western media take a particular side in that.
Yeah,
like I didn't see like Western press supporting either Armenia or Azerbaijan, and Russia didn't really care either, to be honest. It was quite interesting even though it was a quite significant hot conflict, how uninvolved if you want to call it this way, the international community was. Quite strange, because usually you get all kinds of proxy wars from situations like that.
We did actually delve into this on the Year in Review show, where a lot of stories that would have otherwise been the top stories of the year were pushed so far aside because of everything else that happened, particularly COVID, arguably the color revolution within the United States, and the election, of course, which those three things are all sort of tied together. But those three just overshadowed a lot of news out of Syria, out of Iran, out of the Caucasus, out of Russia. Belarus would have also probably been an even bigger story had all of that not happened. But it seems like these stories that really have a lot of impact, at least within their particular regions, and
I mean, also, like in the region, the alliance system itself is quite difficult, because quite complex, because like Armenia is at the same time being headed by a pro-Western Soros puppet, but still is part of a defense organization with Russia and integrated into the Eurasian Economic Union and things like that. Whereas Azerbaijan is a, oil-based dictatorship or whatever, but at the same time aligned with NATO member Turkey and with Israel, and they have very good relations with Israel. And then Russia itself also has at least mutually beneficial trade relations with Azerbaijan, let's say. So the sides here weren't very clear, like who is who, basically. It's not your typical East versus West conflict here.
Well,
I think the other thing that has to be mentioned is his poor planning for, these inevitabilities, because I wonder if there was some kind of backroom stipulation that he not properly defend Nagorno-Karabakh. I don't know. It seems foolish because the region itself is divided and has had a frozen war for decades. Something like what happened in September of last year seems pretty inevitable. And it's just, for me, it's mind-boggling, even if he is this Soros puppet, which I'm sure he is. You think he would have been more prudent. But I don't know if that was done because there were certain expectations from Turkey and Azerbaijan, and they basically had something to do with it, or it had to do with, whatever branch of globalism, or it was just a mistake on his part, of a short-sightedness. Because, in 2018, it seems like Armenia weathered that pretty well. And I think that's why 2020 was such a surprise. But nonetheless, he's lost it, and he's lost all his credibility.
Yeah, I think we are going to see the effects from that in the coming years. But again, for me personally, it's a difficult region about which I don't know all too much. So my takes here are not the hottest, I guess.
Fair enough.
Mm-hmm.
It's, I'm not particularly too well versed in the Caucasus myself, and I actually learned quite a bit in September, October about this particular conflict and sort of the history behind it. And even though it looks like it's more or less settled for now, I don't think we've really seen the end of it, and I suppose time will tell. But as we teased at the beginning of the show, getting into the main topic, it looks like Reddit Trotsky has found his way into a 3.5-year prison sentence, if I understand correctly.
Yeah, like you're referring to Navalny, right?
Of course.
Yeah, Reddit Trotsky.
Reddit Trotsky. I haven't heard him being referred to that way. I personally call him our national Bitcoin millionaire. I like that moniker particularly. Like other pro-government people are calling him the Russian beauty blogger. So, but I'll take up Reddit Trotsky into my armory, I guess. So yeah, what was happening with Navalny? Let's start from the beginning, I guess. Not from the beginning of his political career, but from the beginning of this particular saga. So Navalny, last year, a couple of months ago, I have forgotten when it happened exactly, but not so long ago, was apparently poisoned or something like that. We don't know completely for sure, but he certainly had some health issues, whatever they were caused. And he was hospitalized first in Russia and then transferred to a hospital in Germany, where, of course, the Western media immediately started claiming that the Russian security services poisoned him with the deadliest poison on earth that has never killed a single person with Novichok. It's funny with Novichok, like the entire thing. I didn't exaggerate right now. They claim it is extremely, extremely deadly. Like when the Salisbury thing happened, for example, you saw all these British biowarfare guys completely dressed up in chemical warfare suits and things like that, and the press was releasing statements that Novichok is like so deadly, like even if your skin comes into contact with it, you're basically going to die. But all the cases we've heard about failed to actually kill the target or whatever. It's kind of retarded. So anyway, he was in Berlin with some kind of health issue, and I don't have a theory on that. Don't ask me. Like maybe he was poisoned by Russian security services. Maybe he was, I don't know, poisoned by the CIA to get a reason to start political trouble in Russia or whatever. Maybe he poisoned himself or whatever. I have no idea.
Teenage girl syndrome.
So. Yeah, perhaps. So anyway, since that began, he became more public again because Navalny in the recent years, the peak of his career was probably in like 2012, but in recent years he wasn't much talked about anymore in Russia. And then when he recovered, he returned to Russia, where he was arrested. But he was before that, while still in Germany, he actually released a video investigation where he claimed to have found out which exact FSB agents poisoned him and tried to kill him. And one of their journalists actually went to the home of one of those guys and harassed him and things like that. And then Putin, in an interview, when asked about that particular event, he said that yes, indeed, FSB guys are following Navalny, but he made strong hints to the extent that it's basically because they assume that he is a CIA asset, which is used for what's it called? For laundering information or something like that. So basically the same way Bellingcat acts. Navalny acts as a front for releasing CIA intelligence into the Russian public without the CIA itself doing it, basically. So that's what Putin said about Navalny, which is quite credible, actually. I think
it's fair. It's a fair assessment.
Yeah, I actually think that is what he is doing mostly, because then I think shortly before returning to Russia, he also released another big so-called investigation. Now that one was a complete flop, but we need to talk about that separately. I think it's quite a big topic, where he claimed to have found Putin's so-called palace, and he claimed that Putin, he claimed that Putin has a personal palace worth $1.2 billion in the south of Russia, basically.
Was that supposed to be an own? Because that place was pretty nice, especially compared to a lot of the, what I would say, fancy boxes Western elites live in. I mean, you've seen them. You've seen the so-called mansions that are elites live in. It's they're boring. They're tasteless. Like, I have my proper disdain for Trump in many ways, but I can appreciate his tacky gold decorations just for the fact that he's saying, "Hey, I'm rich." And you know what? Putin's supposed palace, I wish it was real, because it was very tasteful and made me think, this guy has good taste. He seems pretty, he seems like he's got a good head on his shoulders, at least insofar as that goes.
I have much the same take. Like, I don't care whether Putin has a palace, to be honest. Like, the guy is responsible for the lives of 150 million people. Why shouldn't he have a palace? Why should only oligarchs, be rich? It doesn't make much sense politically. It's not how power dynamics work. So, like, I really like, if everything that Navalny said in this investigation was real, I wouldn't care, like, at all. $1.2 billion is the price of a good 5-star hotel somewhere. And for example, Russia, I'm not even talking about the Russian economy at large. Russia has a rainy day fund, which is called the National Welfare Fund, where state surpluses are saved for eventually spending them in national infrastructure projects and things like that. And the National Welfare Fund has $174 billion in it. So basically, if Putin has a palace, then it's less than 1% of the money that's in our National Welfare Fund. So the sum itself is extremely comical. Like, if Putin didn't have that palace, and if that money was indeed like taken from the state budget, which it wasn't, and if it was spent instead on, like, I don't know, a couple of hospitals, some road repairs here and there, like, the average Russian at large still wouldn't notice much of a difference. So it's a non-issue. Even if it was true, it's a non-issue, you know.
You got to admit, though, if the palace had been designed by whoever designed John Podesta's place, the reactions would have been quite different. Like, I mean, you have some paintings that are, suggestive of pedophilia, a dead guy sculpture. It would have been very different. They would have been conflicted.
Yeah,
I mean, damn it, I hate that he's rich, but he does have good taste.
Yeah, or like one of those little Epstein temples.
Yeah, I just was about to speak about that. Like, it's one of those moments where my ingrained Russian whataboutism comes about. Like, I'd rather live in a country where the head of the state lives in a nice place than, having a Jeffrey Epstein scandal on hands. Basically, like, I don't give a fuck. Russia still looks much better than the West, even if it is a little bit corrupt.
I don't know. Rich autocrats are pretty based, if you ask me, especially compared to the alternatives. I'm just saying. I think I've been fully sold on the idea. I was always sympathetic, but really, I think this past year has really pulled the trigger for me on that. But like,
I mean, I have some hot takes in terms of elite corruption. I think it should basically just be legalized. I mean, I can't run an election on that platform, but hear me out.
well, here's the real bellwether. How do you feel about fox hunting?
I'm in support of that, as long as it's not populations threatened of extinction or something like that. But Putin actually once shot a tiger, so there you go.
oh, going above and beyond, are we?
Yeah, Putin is tiger hunting. He's like the real Chad. But my hot take on elite corruption is a slight diversion from our main topic, but just humor me, is that, like, back in Tsarist times, for example, or you could say like absolutist monarchy in Europe and things like that, it was just assumed that the state budget is just the personal wealth of the reigning sovereign. Like, at the time when the Versailles Palace was built, 60% of the French GDP was actually spent on it, and nobody gave a fuck. And I support that mindset and attitude, because at least, when it wasn't perceived as corruption, the elites, and we all know that they are rich, like, fighting elite corruption is like a fight against windmills. Like, Jesus Christ, powerful people are rich and interlinked, all right. It's just a given, I think. So when they didn't have to hide it, they built nice stuff where people could see and enjoy it. And now it's part of worldwide cultural heritage. And basically, when the elites don't have to hide that they're fucking elites, and if they don't have to pretend that they're just your average guy, then we can enjoy nice things, like all of us. Why didn't Putin build his nice palace in the Moscow city center where I could take a walk around its gardens or something like that? So that's my...
Could I ask, you hear different claims and reports. Do we know for sure it's even his place?
No, it isn't. That's why I said the second investigation flopped like really, really hard. But
right.
Talk about it separately. Like with the poisoning investigation, again, I have no idea who poisoned Navalny or whatever caused his health issue. No one can tell, I think, at this point. But with the palace is a different topic. But anyway, when he was poisoned, it wasn't such a big issue. In fact, like, nobody really talked about Navalny for quite some years, since about 2017. like in 2017, when he was arrested, he drew relatively for his political profile, he drew relatively large crowds in Moscow for protests, which were way, way larger, again, than the very small crowds we saw after he was allegedly poisoned, after he released like his most popular video ever, and we need to talk about that as well, and after he was arrested and actually sentenced to jail time. He drew much smaller and more pathetic crowds than he drew in 2017 when he was just arrested. So basically, all of this is a giant failure for the Russian liberal opposition, but we are going to get to that. So I think now we need to discuss the Palace video, which was quite interesting. I think he released.
Before we move on, I do want to get your opinion on something, because this is something we've tossed around the show briefly. Just one question. So we've pretty much narrowed down that Navalny is pretty much going to become a distant exile, and in 2024, will he be at the DNC or the RNC?
Navalny supports Bernie Sanders, so I guess at the DNC.
You know that shouldn't surprise me, but it does.
But at least, like, he was the only Russian liberal opposition figure who also protested against Trump being banned from Twitter. But I guess not because of his genuineness or whatever, or his genuine concern for free speech, but just because he felt that it would be bad for him to support such a blatant act of censorship if he himself is kind of threatened by it in Russia. So he needed to, to appear genuine or something like that. But let's talk about the Palace video, I guess, right? So he released it shortly before returning to Russia. So he wanted to return on he wanted to create a lot of noise before coming back to Russia. And now the Palace video itself, what is noteworthy about it? First of all, that so-called palace, the building that he was showing, is not new at all. It was known to exist for over 10 years. And yes, indeed, it was for over 10 years rumored to belong to Putin or to one of his close associates or whatever. It's completely stale information. The only thing that he has done is basically present it in a, I don't know, more engaging format or whatever, or just create more hype about it. But the investigation itself, there was nothing new to it. But it was still gained, I think right now, the video is at around 90 million views or something like that, which seems enormous considering that Russia has a population of just 146 million people. But it just speaks to the fact that, first of all, that's speculation, but I think it's quite plausible that a lot of those views come from bots. But I don't even think that that's the main driver. The other thing is that YouTube's algorithm manipulated it in such a way that it was suggested to basically everyone, like certainly to everyone in Russia. It's even like if you were watching something completely unrelated and your video finished, you had quite like high chance that the Navalny video would autoplay after the video that you watched, because the algorithm was set up in such a way. And even if you close the tab after 10 seconds, it also counts as a click. And then also he released it with English subtitles. So actually most of those views are not from Russia. A lot of them are for sure from Ukraine and other parts of the former Soviet Union that don't like Russia, but also a lot of international viewers, because the video went fucking ballistic on Le Reddit. So yeah, it looks like a big deal if you just look at the view count, but it really isn't inside Russia. There was some analysis I've read that actually what was it? I don't know where the data came from, maybe from Google Analytics or something like that. But I read that if you look at the stats, then only 3 million people in Russia watched the entire video from the beginning to the end, and the average watch time is something like 15 minutes or something like that. So again, it looks like it looks as if it caused a lot of public interest, but it really didn't. Not within Russia itself. Again, Russia is not the Reddit. So that much for the noise that it made. And now for the so-called investigation itself, again, they put out pictures of a building that has been known to exist for over 10 years. And then they portrayed the interiors. But what they portrayed were not photographs or something like that from the interiors. It was completely made up. Like they just drew furniture and stuff like that into the rooms. It was like a rendering, basically. All of this Photoshop. They didn't deny it or whatever. Like they said in the video that it was Photoshop, but basically they presented it as if this was the actual palace interior. So what happened relatively shortly after that video came out? Actually, the government decided to simply let journalists go into that palace, and they filmed it, and it turned out to be completely empty. So it's basically just a construction site. It really is just a construction site. They walked around the building, all of it is empty, like the outer facade is largely finished, but inside there is nothing, like completely naked walls, no one lives there, etc., etc. And then also a couple of weeks later, the Russian oligarch, don't let me confuse him, Viktor Vekselberg, I think, or maybe, Rothenberg, a Jewish oligarch, claimed that he was the owner of the palace, which is kind of likely. I don't know. I can say whether it belongs to Putin, but it doesn't make much sense. It has been a construction site for over 10 years now. It's uninhabited. It's something some rich person started and never finished, and then Arkady Rothenberg comes out and says, "Hey guys, it's actually my palace, like whatever." I think it's quite believable. And then also it was funny, like they fucked up a lot during the presentation of the so-called palace. Like, for example, there's a moment in the video where Navalny shows you the supposed front gate of the palace, which is a gate decorated by an imperial golden eagle, and supposedly looks like the front gate of the Winter Palace. And Navalny himself in the video says like, Putin thinks of himself as if he's the Tsar or something like that. But then, but then someone zoomed in on that golden eagle on the gate, and you see that the coat of arms in the middle of the eagle is not the Russian coat of arms, but the coat of arms of Montenegro. So whoever was making the rendering was probably not even Russian, So it's quite likely that actually he was given that all those renderings. He was given them by his Western handlers or something like that, who can't distinguish a Russian coat of arms from a Montenegrin coat of arms. Like, I mean, every Russian would have seen that. It came out immediately. And they just put an eagle with the coat of arms of Montenegro in their video. It's completely retarded. So that's why I said it was basically a huge flop. So there's really nothing to say about the so-called palace investigation. It was all a giant lie. It was a massive hoax by Navalny, and he still used it to create uproar in Russia, because basically after he returned to Russia, he was arrested because he had a previous court sentence, but he was out on probation. It was in a money laundering case or something like that, where he was sentenced to 3.5 years on probation. And he broke the terms of his probation repeatedly, and that's why he was arrested immediately after landing in Moscow, and he was taken to court, and he was now actually sentenced to a real prison sentence for 2.5 years. So he will be going to prison, and obviously he tried to instigate huge protests over this in Russia, but it also failed completely, because all his guys went out to protest illegally on only 2 weekends, and then they gave up. So basically the first protest didn't draw a very big crowd, was very small. They had like 15,000 people in Moscow, which has a population of like 15 million people, I think. So it's really, really low. They had like 10 to 15,000 people in St. Petersburg, and they had very small crowds in the provinces, like they had maybe like 200 people in Vladivostok, for example, 500 people in Khabarovsk, numbers like that, basically. So they completely discredited themselves. They thought of themselves as more influential than they really are. They really showed to the entire nation that their entire grift is a failed operation, and that they have lost all political capital that they had in Russia. Basically, in the last couple of weeks, the liberal opposition made a laughing stock out of itself. Then the second protest that they made drew even smaller crowds, and then they just gave up. And also, regardless of the very small crowds that they drew, the Russian police actually acted quite harshly against them, in that they really took their job seriously this time. And I'm not referring to them like, I don't know, beating up protesters. They did really little of that. They were pretty tame, actually, which is good. So they didn't allow the liberal opposition to create many provocations, which would then have been used to paint a picture of Russian police brutality or something like that. There was some of that, there were some provocations, but it didn't happen on a mass scale. They were certainly much more tame than, like, at the same time, French police that is firing rubber bullets at Yellow Vest protesters and using water throwers, or whatever they're called. So yeah, and what is the most significant result of this is that now the Russian state finally is seriously cracking down on the so-called liberal opposition. I mean, Navalny received jail time. A lot of their head people were also arrested and charged with charges like instigating minors to participate in illegal protests. All of their top people are facing a lot of lawsuits right now. I think a lot of them will be taken out. And then also the FSB released a video of Navalny's right-hand man in London, a guy called Ashurkov, where he was talking to a British MI6 agent and asking him for money and promising him that if his people would come to power in Russia, they would basically reward the Westerners who financed them with billions of dollars, which put was another large hint at the reputation of the, again, so-called liberal opposition in Russia. And that also goes hand in hand with a trend that started in December, which is a large crackdown on Western-sponsored foreign agent media. A lot of them are facing the threat of having their licenses revoked, so they will no longer be able to air their stuff. For example, Radio Free Europe was ordered by the Russian court under the new foreign agents law to mark all of their content as content created by a registered foreign agent. And they refused to do it, and now they have to pay a relatively large fine, and they will continue to be fined until they comply with the law. And we see a lot of that stuff. And then Putin himself at Davos was talking about the threat of digital monopolies in relation to the Trump banning and things like that. The former President Medvedev put out a article on the official Kremlin a website about the threat for national security that is coming from digital monopolists like Google and Twitter. So they're talking on the largest available platforms about digital sovereignty and things like that, and at the same time purging liberal media, purging liberal figureheads, all of their agents. So basically, we are observing a big fat purge right now, which was long overdue, which is why I'm saying that basically, for me, I always perceived that the Western-sponsored liberal opposition was the largest acute threat to Russia, and now I see the government taking care of it, and basically that solves like most of Russia's problems, to be honest.
One of the things I just want to mention about the Navalny protests, well, maybe two things. One is their size, which was far smaller than what we saw in Belarus, a country of 9 million. You could not argue that they had enormous and consistent turnouts. Arguably, it was for an election that makes a much bigger difference than, a guy that has virtually no political support, but is a popular vlogger. So I understand the difference, but I think expectations were far higher. And I think that, that brings me around to asking the second question, which was, who were these protests for? In my opinion, the protests were, they always are, but they're far more so for a Western audience, particularly an American audience, than they are for anything else. Because, especially I would say within the Anglosphere, but particularly, say, in America and to a lesser extent in Canada, like one of the ways that citizens there, especially those who've been there quite a while, find validation is by seeing protests around the world. For them, it's kind of like a ritual that was enacted, a rebellion ritual. And they're seeing these lesser countries, these more backward countries, doing the ritual, right? And it validates them. It validates the narrative of the big evil tyrant and the government for the people and everything. And it does allow them to forget their own problems, right? Now, with the Radlibs in power in America, they were always in power, but they're visibly in power now. I would say that in many ways, what happened January 6th was an embarrassment, even though it was essentially an entrapment process. It came at a great cost. And I think the desire right now is to project power. And one of the ways to project power is, to have Biden up there saying, like, I'm going to crack down on you guys. And, you're going to see, you're going to pay the price, Putin, for your dastardly deeds, and so on and so on. So I think like these protests in many ways were for a Western audience. Now they might play a role within the EU. They might have been there also to project American power in Germany. And we're seeing already that that's not effective, because this week Germany has basically said that the situation with Navalny has nothing to do with Nord Stream 2, but America would beg to differ. So I just wanted to mention a few things about the way the Navalny protests can be looked at outside of Russia.
Perhaps, but I think it's a bit far-fetched to say that they were just organized so the Reddit would have something to talk about. It's
no, I'm not saying that though. But I'm not saying that. Like, how can I put it? American culture is so dominant worldwide that any protest, right, does have a resounding like it has a way of obfuscating like problems within Western countries, right? Like the Hong Kong protests, did as much for the image of the West as they did, trying to fight, evil Beijing.
I get what you're saying, but
like I'm not promoting that they have a single use function. I'm saying they have a multitude of functions.
No, yes, of course, we know that Western media likes to use these things to create a news cycle that reinforces their agenda and things like that. But on the other hand, like it would have made some sense if those protests would have been used by the American regime to as a not trigger but prerequisite or whatever to start a more belligerent political course towards Russia.
I think they will. They're going to introduce new sanctions.
Yes, but those sanctions are completely pathetic because we are already sanctioned to death. All the last sanctions that came out, like, I mean, new sanctions against Russia are introduced every like 2 or 3 months or whatever, but all they do now is basically just sanction state officials and things like that. So basically they don't allow them to hold bank accounts in the West, which is actually beneficial for Russia. Forces us on a more sovereignist course, and they don't allow them to travel to the West and things like that. So what we are seeing are mostly sanctions against private individuals because they already, or state officials, because they already pulled all their levers that they had on our economy. Really early, like back in 2014, they introduced the harshest sanctions, which are those that, for example, prevent Russian companies from accessing the Western financial markets, which prevent certain technological transfers, which reduce exports and imports of certain goods and things like that. They've already leveraged all that they had on our economy. Now, the most sanctions that they're doing now are mostly symbolic. When the news of the incoming sanctions came out, the Russian stock market didn't even budge a lot. So it's all just for show.
Yeah, no, I'm aware they're ineffective. I'm just saying that America is such that it can afford to exercise these forms of soft power. After all, everybody feels obligated to demonstrate to some degree their commitment to democracy, right?
Yes, indeed. But my personal take is that here in this situation, Putin has just simply won because.
Oh yeah, no, I'm not saying he lost. I'm saying that I'm just talking about perceptions, right? Like no one is accusing of America in the last 2 years of being like a genius. Like even the January 6th storming of the White House, as feeble and funny as it was, like all it did was force America's own hand as to how it would deal with any Trump supporters. Now, all it'll do, I mean, yes, on the one hand, it will destroy the right wing for quite some time in America, but it will not alleviate the division in America, and it made America generally look weak, right? I mean,
yes,
America's hubris is that it's solipsistic, so it doesn't think anybody else exists, and it therefore doesn't think anybody else is watching, right? Like it's watching itself, so it's in a vacuum in that way, right? It doesn't consider how other countries view this.
The January 6th protest was also quite interesting in that, I see how, let's call them the neoliberal elite or something like that, how they won something in terms of internal politics, but they lost a lot in terms of America's image on the international stage in the way they handled this. And that starts even back from the banning of Donald Trump on Twitter. I mean, that has made life very difficult for a lot of CIA operatives around the world who now have a very hard time defending this image of America as a bastion of freedom and free speech and things like that, when the sitting president of the United States is banned of the most relevant political speech platform.
Now you listen here. The American Empire stands for free speech when it comes to you being able to fly a rainbow flag proudly from everywhere from Washington to Vladivostok to Beijing to Hanoi. Look, trust me, to Tehran especially.
I mean, I can tell you so much, actually. Maybe that is going to interest you or
Do tell.
Yeah, maybe that's going to interest your Western audience. Like one of the effects of the Trump banning from Twitter was that the Russian non-systemic pro-Western opposition was in a complete panic mode. Like we have this one political figure, he is called Svetov. He's the leader of the unregistered Libertarian Party of Russia. Yeah, I know it's ridiculous that Russia is a libertarian party, and he's also he's also a known pedophile, by the way. So
there you go. That guy! Oh boy!
This always checks out.
It always checks out. So he was on a stream with two other guys. One of them, I think, was also a Navalnyite and some other oppositionist. And he was completely panic-stricken from the news that Trump was banned off Twitter, not because banning Trump is somehow unjust, but because it justifies Putin's course towards a more sovereign internet and sovereign information policy. Because like last year, Russia has doubled all of its existing internet infrastructure. So just in case the Americans decide to cut us off from the global internet, that we would be able to use our own national cables to have an internal internet and to maybe link it up with other independent countries and things like that. So it's a national security measure. And then again, as I told you more recently, they're pushing through a lot of laws that will concern media platforms and things like that right now. And Svetov, was in panic because the Americans are proving Putin's politics right, and that is non-unbeneficial for him, because Putin cannot be right because they have to protest him. That's his job. So. Yeah, the Americans, and I think those are either knowing or unwitting American assets in Russia, and there will be many more such assets in many more other countries, and they all will have a much harder time to convince their audiences now that America is a champion for their freedom, which is now completely discredited.
Now, to bring it all back around, the one other big topic we have not broached yet is the Russian energy domination over Europe and just how horrible that is, and Nord Stream 2 and their deals with Germany. I know Germany has a very special place in your heart, as you have gone on at length before, but it looks like Nord Stream 2 combined with Biden's policy towards Keystone and oil drilling on federal lands in the United States has created quite an interesting storm, to say the least, in terms of the global energy markets. And it looks like it's continuing on as usual, where the U.S. is really trying to sanction a country or sanction a companies or individuals to take part in building this pipeline that's 95% done, 99% done.
Yeah, it's almost finished, really.
And it looks like it's an inevitability that it's going to be completed, yet they're trying to make just the last few stages as painful as possible for all those involved. And I mean, at the end of the day, I don't think they're going to stop this, but I figured, of course, while we have you here, we might as well get the so-called insider's perspective on this ambitious project that's been going on since, I believe, 2014, 2015?
Yeah, something like that, yes. Well, I'm quite surprised that the European Union doesn't simply budge to America's will in this instance. It's quite unusual to see such a big rift between these two polities, because it's quite funny. The text of the American sanctions that are introduced again and again in relation to the Nord Stream 2 project usually says things like, we are worried about Europe's energy security and about Europe's well-being or whatever. And the Europeans themselves are saying, hey guys, like, where are you not letting us just finish this pipeline because we are going to get cheap gas from it? We actually want this to happen. Like, the Americans are speaking on behalf of the European Union, which does not agree to this course. Actually, almost, I haven't heard of a single European, wait, no, like the Eastern Europeans don't like it, of course, but I haven't heard of any important European Union country which was opposed to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Like, very recently, the Germans reiterated their commitment to finishing the pipeline. The Austrians said that they do not want to see the Navalny situation affecting the completion of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Even Emmanuel Macron came out saying that he supports finishing the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and will work together with the Germans to complete this project. So it's quite interesting for me why Europe, in this particular instance, doesn't really submit to American wishes here. That's really quite remarkable.
Mm-hmm.
But
for a while, it looked like it might have been stopped. I mean, if you go back to early December, it was kind of uncertain, and there was the very striking contrast between what Biden had said on the 4th of February. I made it clear to President Putin that the days of the United States rolling over in the face of Russia's aggressive actions, interfering with our elections, cyber attacks, poisoning its citizens are over. Only we are going to tamper with our elections. Thank you very much. It's Jover. And then Joseph Borrell, less than 24 hours later, is meeting with Lavrov and says Russia is our biggest neighbor. It's part of Europe. Engagement with Russia is therefore of key importance to the European Union. And questioned again about Nord Stream, he affirmed that it's still a go and that it's not going to stop because, Putin bad, Navalny good.
Yeah. I mean, even as far as Biden is concerned, I think my predictions here on the Biden presidency are coming true somewhat. He might be rhetorically loud on Russia because that is what is expected from him, but it seems to me that he is in a better...
It's for an American audience.
Yeah, but it seems to me that he is in a better position to actually practically deal with Russia than Trump was. Because, for example, I don't know much on the details, but even Merkel came out saying that she had a phone call with Biden and said that the new American administration is actually willing to work out a deal that would be agreeable to all sides as far as Nord Stream 2 is concerned. So maybe, they will kind of soften their stance on that. I don't know what will come out of that. And also Biden, after his first call with Putin, they agreed to prolong the strategic arms treaty, which Trump unilaterally quit. And maybe they're even going to recommit to the Open Skies Treaty, which also Trump unilaterally left. I think Trump was more aggressive on Russia than Joe Biden will be.
In his own words, I am the toughest president on Russia that we've ever had, and I remember, like, in the light of the whole RussiaGate thing before that was put to a close. I think all in retrospect we see that was the direction of this, to prevent any real sort of even just easing of tensions, because that was unthinkable for, of course, a lot of the DC elite on both the so-called Republican and so-called Democratic side, but. I do think you make a good point about, and funny enough, I think Southfront actually put out a video about this like in September, saying it's sort of like how Nixon and Reagan were able to deal with the Soviet Union because they came in like with their history of hardline anti-communists. So when they were able to go over there, there was no whispers, there was no accusations that like, oh, you might be a sympathizer or whatever. And that's sort of the case people were making for Biden. I didn't necessarily buy into it at the time. I don't necessarily buy into it now, but I do think it can be sort of a return to the at least status quo, if you will, where there are all these agreements on paper, where things are, where relations are decent on paper, but ultimately global trends are taking the course that they are, and a
I
lot of
mean,
that.
obviously, we don't need to kid ourselves. Like the United States and Russia will continue to be enemies and things
Well,
like
of
that. But
course.
yes, but just what you said, I think it will just be easier for Russia to deal with the new political administration in the US because it isn't surrounded by so much political hysteria. I mean, each time when Trump met up with Putin, which didn't happen a lot, they basically were ready to accuse him of treason just for shaking his hand. So I think Biden will be in a much stronger position on that one. And also, as I repeatedly made this argument, we had not exactly warm relations, of course, but much more functional ones with the Obama administration, for example.
Well, I mean, much of the pressure that Trump introduced against Russia in the first place had to do with the whole Russia hoax,
Yes, yes.
anyways, right? I mean, that was used very strategically. He had to um, he had to prove that he wasn't a Putin agent at every single turn. So,
Exactly.
right. But there are certain things that I mean, the meeting that he had with Putin in Helsinki was
Mhm.
remarkable when you look back, and really a lot of the pressure that he exerted only came quite late. It came at like nearly the end of 2018, and then it was very consistent throughout 2019, 2020. That's because he had no other way of, proving that he wasn't a Russian agent, even though information had already come out, like Mark Elias, for instance, who was partly responsible for the Steele dossier. Uh, the FBI agent who doctored the emails in order to, and he's received nothing. He's received something like a fine and forced out of work for 100 days, some kind of nonsense. And ironically, Mark Elias is now complaining about a vote that's still going in the northern part of New York State. And he's come out and said that Dominion voting machines have problems counting votes. Of course, that wasn't the case on November the 3rd, but just, you know, there's good and bad Dominion voting machines. So it didn't matter how
The only way to stop a bad
like
guy with the
how much you
Dominion
could
voting
prove it was
machine
all
is
a
a good guy with
hoax.
the Dominion voting machine.
Yes.
Yeah, it's different if we do it.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Nord Stream 2, do you guys have any particular hot takes on that? Because again, to me, I think what's going on there is quite obvious. From Russia's side, we are mostly interested in directing our gas away from Ukraine so that the Ukrainians don't get all this transfer money they're earning from our gas transfers, and also um, our pipelines as such are vulnerable because they're going through the territory of a hostile state. I think that's the main motivation. Then, of course, just increasing exports to the European Union makes perfect sense from Russia's point, and tying the European Union more closely to our energy market, making it more dependent on our energy, thus gaining certain political leverages, makes perfect sense for the Europeans. Hey, cheap gas, all right. Looks like, we are in a situation where Russia is basically saying I consent, and the European Union is saying I consent, and then the United States is like but didn't you forget to ask someone? So
Now, I'm gonna say what I said probably about 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, where not that I'm saying it would happen, but if anything were to be the spark for a hot war in Europe again, it would be the current energy disputes. And I also said this, I don't think it would happen, but it wouldn't surprise me if they got really desperate about a decade down the road if we saw sabotage efforts towards these new Russian pipelines. Now, I think that's pretty far off, but again, things the past few years have taught me 2019, 2020, crazy years in their own right, and it's looking like this one isn't going to be any more calm or any more normal, so to speak. But it wouldn't surprise me from the next few years that if that didn't happen, but became a consideration among a significant amount of the American elite or Western elite that we got to do something about this, and maybe like some plausibly deniable tax or something along those lines.
Oh, that might happen, but before that happens, a lot of other stuff will also happen. So it will be really hard to judge the geopolitical situation from the knowledge that we have right now. I mean, like in a case where the United States is actively sabotaging Russian pipelines, will that be the point where Russia will start to directly respond to such provocations? And I don't know, for example, bomb Saudi pipelines in the Middle East or something like that. I mean, that is if that happens, it's going to be a very weird world in which we are going to live.
I know the situations aren't exactly comparable, but it's sort of the point it came to with Iran under Trump, where it was these proxy attacks. I mean, I think even a few weeks ago, the Houthis in Yemen were attacking Saudi oil infrastructure yet again. And I think that was like right after Biden was sworn into office. So I do think things would have to get significantly worse before it ever got to that point. But with the current trends, it wouldn't surprise me if in the next decade or so that became a possibility.
Yeah, I mean, it is possible, but my opinion is that if we get that far, then we will simply have other issues to worry about.
Oh, of course.
Then, yeah, then just attacks on the gas pipeline.
And just to, I think just round out these past, next 10, 15 minutes or so to wrap things up. Not much has happened yet, but with Biden in, one of the biggest concerns was that his ties to Ukraine, of course, his son working for the Ukrainian energy company, and again, this was thrown around a lot on South Front. They made quite a few videos, wrote a few articles about it, that we would see an escalation in the fighting in eastern Ukraine under a Biden administration, that the Ukrainian forces would feel emboldened to pick this conflict back up to where it was maybe in 2015, 2016. Do you see things going that way, or do you think that's mostly
Not
settled down?
necessarily. I mean, Biden's family directly benefiting from Ukrainian corruption is not necessarily an issue to, for the Biden administration to support any Ukrainian offensive attacks in the East or something like that. I mean, they're not like just because Hunter Biden is basically robbing the Ukrainian people doesn't mean he's a Ukrainian nationalist or something like that. They can just continue to benefit from that situation without doing anything. And there are some interesting developments in Eastern Ukraine because, but more from the Russian side, because recently Margarita Simonyan, the head of Russia. The head of Russia Today, the chief editor, she went to Donetsk, which is the capital of the Donetsk People's Republic, one of those two self-proclaimed republics there. And she actually presided over a conference where she personally, and she is pretty closely linked to the Kremlin elites, basically. And she personally came out with statements saying directly that Mother Russia, please bring the people of the Donbass home, like let them join Russia. It's a literal quote. I'm not making this up.
Wow.
Yeah, and the conference itself was dedicated to the official announcement of the so-called what was it? Russian Donbass doctrine, I think. And it's quite unusual for anything in which Russian state officials participate to say the word Ruskiye a lot, which is the ethnic distinguisher of the Russian people. We usually, if they refer to citizens of Russia, they say Россияне. Just two different terms, one for citizens, one for the ethnic group. And the state officials rarely refer to Russians as an ethnic group. But there, Jesus, you better believe me, they use the R word a lot. So there might be something on the way. But 2 days after that, the Kremlin press secretary Dmitry Peskov was asked about those statements and whether Russia had any intentions to annex the Donbas or whatever. And he said, no, it's not currently part of the Kremlin agenda. So, like, the official Kremlin position is no, that they're not going to do any aggressive action. But nonetheless, they sent, as the Joker said in the. Maybe as the Joker said in the Batman movie, like, it's not about annexing the Donbas, it's about sending a message, right? So, so I doubt someone like Margarita Simonyan would have been allowed to go there and speak in such words if there was not some agenda behind it. We just don't know what it's going to be about, but obviously things are starting to move in that kind of frozen conflict. So I think something interesting will come along in eastern Ukraine, but again, based on a Russian initiative. I don't think that, just because Hunter Biden is involved in some corruption scandal involving Ukraine, they're necessarily going to protect their Ukrainian assets from the Kremlin or whatever like that. That doesn't make immediate sense to me.
Well, I know in a similar vein that in Ukraine over the past week or so, Medvedchuk's media outlets, his pro-Russian media outlets, have been targeted and censored by the Ukrainian government. And this, of course, is during the Navalny protest, where the totalitarian Russia shut down the just free democratic expression of the Russian people in such a horrid manner. But our strategic allies in Ukraine are just fighting subversion.
The Twitter of the United States Embassy in Kiev and the Twitter of the United States Embassy in Moscow at the same time was pretty funny to read them at the same time. Like,
I can only imagine. And
the one was condemning like Russia for being such a totalitarian dictatorship that dares to, have a police presence at unsanctioned mass gatherings, especially during a pandemic and things like that. And then Ukraine, which literally just shut down all opposition news media. And also Zelensky introduced sanctions against Ukrainian citizens, which he is not allowed under the Ukrainian constitution and the Ukrainian law. So he's breaking his own country's law. And they're saying like, oh, the United States Embassy in Kiev is like praising him for, fighting Russian disinformation propaganda and things like that. It's completely retarded.
Well, I'm just glad that our proud allies stood up against tyranny and followed in the same footsteps of.
I mean, I'm starting to think that it must be really hard to be an American citizen. I mean, if you're not red-pilled, it must be really hard to not just live in a state of permanent cognitive dissonance or something like that.
Oh, I have my extensive engagements with liberal Twitter. I know firsthand how these people think. It's quite the delusion. They've really bought into the. Look, foundational myths are one thing. All societies have them, but when they become so absurd to the point where you still buy into them at this point, you're either of a previous generation or, oh boy, you're on something else. And I find it entertaining until I remember the fact that these are the people with institutional powers and their supporters. So all I can say, it do be like that.
It really do be like that, yeah. We was freedom fighters.
Absolutely, and I have to say, brazen move of you Russians to organize a protest to storm our capital, our legislative building. Look, all I can say is I'm a very forgiving, very patient person, very understanding person, but I cannot forgive what your boys did to AOC shoes. That's frankly, that's why I brought you on here to scold you, the chastising person. I'm gonna give you guys one more chance, but if this happens again, I don't know what will happen, but it's not gonna be good for you.
You vouch for nothing, all right. But did they really come out with some theory that Russia organized the Capitol protest?
I've seen articles like that.
Oh yeah, I'll read it like almost immediately afterwards, like a week afterwards. And Biden, he didn't necessarily make an allusion to it in his speech, but pretty much he made an allusion to just like the Russian meddling in American affairs in general. So it has been the usual, and this is not. Everyone thought the Trump narrative, the Russian narrative, would die after Trump got acquitted from it in 2019. They thought it would die after Trump left office, but no. As I was saying about foundational myths, the Trump era has become a foundational myth in and of itself. Not only the United States, but of course the United States global power throughout the world. The world before 2016 practically no longer exists. It is irrelevant to anything going forward, in large part, especially to these people. The narrative begins in 2016, 2017 with Trump Russia, with Charlottesville, with the various so-called scandals of the Trump administration, and to top it all off with the Capitol Hill incident.
Yeah, it's quite a liberal epos that was made up in that time. Indeed, quite a extensive lore.
And all I can say in closing is, thank you, Putler. We couldn't have done it without you, and we're really looking forward. And if you could if fast track those asylum claims, that would be great. Because I'm tired of waiting around. I've done so much work for you over the past what 3 years now, almost 3 years, and really, I don't know, a few rubles, something. Look, I'm a generous guy, but I can only work for free for so long, and I'd like you to relay the message. Hopefully he hears this, but no rush. So long as I get them eventually, but I want confirmation that it is at least going to happen by the end of this year. Okay, so just get in contact. I don't care if Putin, Medvedev, Lavrov, any of them. Just even if you arrange this yourself on their behalf, by all means. But come on, something.
I will try to relay that information. Maybe you will get a nice olive plot of land in Crimea or something like that. I'll try to fight it out for you, basically, with the state bureaucracy.
Wonderful.
And I guess now Putin is also obliged to create more content in September, I guess, when my next appearance is scheduled on the show. I think it will be September. I don't quite know.
Yeah, August, September. Yeah, around that time. If we're still allowed on the internet, I know that. If we're not in the FEMA camps, so to speak.
Yeah. That's why you will have eventually to broadcast from Crimea.
Of course. Now, I say that's probably, I'm not a fan of the cold. I'm a bit thin-skinned, as one may believe, which is pretty strange because pretty brutal winter all throughout the United States, regardless of region. Pretty much the deep South is the only one to escape this giant blanket of snow. That's aside the point, though. But I think Crimea is the warmest I'm going to get, and I graciously accept your offer. Is what I'm getting at.
Perfect. Or I have another big hope, actually. Like here in Russia, we don't deny global warming; we support it.
Ah, yes, yes.
So basically, my big hope is that maybe in the foreseeable future, St. Petersburg, Russia, will maybe have the same weather as St. Petersburg, Florida. So that would also be quite nice. Yeah. So anyway, wait for the global warming, and then you can start planting olives in St. Petersburg. That's all I want to say. And thank you for having me on the show. I guess thank you for giving me a platform for spreading a blatant authoritarian Putinist propaganda, and for engaging in Russian manipulation of the American public. You just make yourself guilty of a lot of crimes, I guess.
We're deep in the hole anyway. A few more won't change the balance of this. But I do have one request for you before you leave. Can you say for our audience, trust the plan in Russian?
Oh, all right. Доверяйте плану.
Thank you very much. And this has been yet another episode of the War Report. Of course, I will link your soon-to-be defunct Telegram if I am to take you at your word down in the description. So people can find you there. They can keep up with your great takes in Russian that I definitely don't have to throw in Google Translate every time you put something out. But it's been a real pleasure. Hopefully there'll be enough news to bring you back in August, September, again, if we're still here. And, I am working alternatives. Don't you be fooled. So, hey, it may not be on YouTube. It may be on some third-rate Russian website, but I'm sure you will help us along this journey because you have just been such a wonderful asset. And, You know, and again,
Hey, no, you're my asset, not the other way around.
No, you're my asset.
I'm the FSP handler.
I'll let you think that. But with that being said, thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Goodbye.